So thank you very much, Claire, and thanks to the Academy for the invitation to deliver this lecture. It's good to be here and talking to you all face-to-face. Originally, I was supposed to deliver a lecture to the Academy some years back in the aftermath of Brexit and connected to themes arising from Brexit, but obviously the pandemic and lockdown intervened in the interim. Now, despite the intervention of lockdown and everything that's going on in the world, I still want to put the question of national sovereignty at the centre of this lecture. And indeed, I want to make the argument that sovereignty is the most important concept and principle for those who have any interest in a democratic international politics, which is to say, a politics that goes beyond elite machinations and geopolitical rivalry. So what I propose to do is to talk about how state sovereignty has fared in the international order, to explain the political problems for an international order that is denuded of sovereignty, and to finish by offering a political solution to carve through these problems. A solution which, of necessity, must rest on strengthening the politics and institutions associated with political independence and national sovereignty. So, as I imagine, most people here are aware, there is much talk at the moment about how we're going through a restructuring of international order, and it's talked about in different ways with varying degrees of honesty and clarity, ranging from talking about the decline of the liberal international order to those who talk about it in terms of the decline of a so-called rules-based order. It's a change, obviously, that's most directly associated with geopolitical rivalry in Europe itself, including but not limited to the war in Ukraine. And underlying this, of course, there's also the relative erosion of US power, the rise of China, and the shift in the center of the global economy towards the Asia-Pacific, precipitating the end of that international order that was defined by US victory in the Cold War and resulted in the system of so-called unipolarity, which is to say an international system in which the US was the sole superpower. Now again, different people date these changes to different points, some to the great financial crash of 2008, others to Trump's election to the White House in 2016, others to the Russian invasion of Ukraine earlier this year. In my own book, I date it to the NATO war over Kosovo in 1999 and the Second Chechen War of the same year. Now, in looking back, there's obviously an owl of Minerva effect, in which the condition of us apprehending the past is the fact that we cannot fully grasp our own present. So it's clear that one type of international order, the type which was defined by unipolar globalization under the aegis of the United States, that order is ending, but it is not clear what's replacing it. Whether it will be a bipolar world divided between two major power centers in Beijing and Washington, whether it might be a multipolar world with multiple power centers in Moscow, Brussels, New Delhi, perhaps Brasilia, as well as Beijing and Washington, or even maybe a so-called apolar world, one without any of the organizing effects that one might expect from logics of power concentration and geopolitical rivalry. Now, I don't propose to arbitrate between these different models of what might come next in terms of different centers of power in world politics. Rather, I want to focus on what an international politics of democratic freedom could look like in the aftermath of unipolarity. And I want to try and build up a picture of the current international order as we go along. So, despite all the confusion of the present moment, two things I think are clear from the previous era. First, that there is no, when I say the previous era, I just mean the era of unipolarity, the one that is coming to an end if it hasn't indeed already ended. So two things are clear. First, that there is no possibility of democracy without sovereignty. And second, that whatever might be changing in the international system, it is clear that the principles of national independence and sovereignty are still being degraded. So what do I mean by this? Let's talk through these two things in turn. So I'd say over the last 30 years, we've gone through a tremendous and in some ways extraordinarily ambitious train of political and legal experimentation in reconstituting the forms and institutions of democracy, political power, and individual rights. And this has had many complex elements, but among the most important is the disembedding of individual rights and democracy, which is to say their extraction from the nation state and their rearticulation in transnational and supranational forms. And this has occurred in tandem with the dilution of state sovereignty. So I'm going to talk through these two trends, beginning with the case of individual rights. So in this preceding era of unipolarity, of ideological and technocratic consensus, it was held that if you converted civic and national rights into human rights, it would offer more protections for the individual from arbitrary state power. It would allow for courts of appeal that were higher than those of the national state and that were not contaminated by national political biases. And obviously the European Court of Justice is the most striking example of such a court. It was believed that if you chisel away at the sovereign immunity which was previously enjoyed by heads of state and government, this would enable us to hold political leaders to account through international criminal courts. And also at the extreme, individuals could even claim armed protection from their own states by calling on supranational agencies such as the United Nations and Nato. So this was a cosmopolitan vision of a global human rights regime that was extracted from the confines of the nation state. Second, in the case of democracy, it was hoped that disembedding democracy from the nation state offered the opportunity to bring government closer to citizens, while also giving citizens more points of access and input into decision-making, potentially making governmental systems more responsive to popular pressure. And this occurred both upwards and downwards. So downwards in the form of devolution and regional autonomy within states, alongside the empowerment of independent agencies, or quangos as they're called here in the UK. It also happened upwards in the form of supranational integration, in which national states were embedded in larger frameworks of supranational coordination, notably massive regional free trade agreements, whose most ambitious exemplar is obviously the European Union. And the promise here was that this pooled sovereignty would yield benefits through collaboration. Now, democracy was to be remolded around these transnational institutions. So we had supranational elections to the European Parliament, as well as the incorporation of so-called civil society representation, with the proliferation of NGOs as vehicles for transmitting social views to decision-making bodies at both the governmental and also at the supranational level. And many liberals supported these processes as goods in and of themselves. And at the same time, for those who were more concerned with democracy, they hoped that democracy could recapture these transnational institutions and networks that were escaping the nation state, and that we could extend democratic engagement beyond the nation state to free democracy from being confined to merely national parliaments and elitist parties. And the most elaborate versions of these theories involved grand plans for reforming the European Parliament, reforming the UN Security Council, and even giving individuals votes in a reformed UN General Assembly. And at the most brutal extreme, this globalized democratic vision involved launching military interventions that were predicated on suppressing the rights of sovereign states and strengthening supranational oversight of state behavior, so substituting the idea of sovereignty as responsibility in place of the vision of sovereignty as autonomy. Now, this supranational oversight of states was taken to an extreme in the carving up of old third world states, the imposition of international tutelage, and even the establishment of new protectorates in places such as Bosnia, Kosovo, East Timor, and with various United Nations peacekeeping operations in Africa. Now, both of these processes, the disembedding of rights and democracy, were predicated on a sustained and systematic suppression of state sovereignty. And state sovereignty was consistently cast as the problem. In economic terms, sovereignty was seen as a justification for parasitism, so either offering self-interested bureaucrats the opportunity to skim and divert resources away from market-efficient outcomes, or that sovereignty offered up this chimerical idea of self-sufficiency, economic self-sufficiency that would deprive citizens of the consumer benefits of a global division of labor. In legal terms, sovereignty was cast as a problem. It was seen as a knot to be untangled, a concentration of national idiosyncrasies that was at odds with global law, which needed to be harmonized across borders. In political terms, Sovereignty was seen as constituting a dangerously egotistical and perhaps even totalitarian concentration of state power that could only empower dictators but also give expressions to the passions of nationalist fury. And consequently, everyone agreed that sovereignty needed to be diluted, tamed, restrained, checked. And it was believed that by compressing or even eliminating that intermediary layer of national states that separated citizens from the global order, it was held that people around the world could gradually be integrated into a global market and a global network of supranational protective institutions that corresponded with a new cosmopolitan era of enhanced consumerism and frictionless population movements. So that was the ideal, that was the vision. In practice, all of these trends tended to enhance the power of technocrats and unelected figures, notably judges, civil servants, both national and transnational, at the expense of parliamentarians, elected officials, and political leaders. And in geopolitical terms, it's no accident that this era also coincided with the era of unipolarity, just to say the era of US victory in the Cold War, when there was a single center of global political and military power that overshadowed all the rest. Unipolarity facilitated these processes of global harmonization and coordination and alignment. And with the dissolution of the Eastern Bloc at the end of the Cold War, there was obviously no counterweight to US power, which allowed for a string of uninterrupted military campaigns around the world, beginning with the US invasion of Panama in 1989 and continuing through to Joe Biden's bombing of Syria just a few days ago in a country where there is still US ground forces in place. And this forever war is in stark contrast to the restraints on the exercise of military power that have been built up in the course of the Cold War. And surveying the last 30 years from the vantage point of 2022, I think we can confidently say that this cosmopolitan project has failed. So, since national sovereignty is a necessary but insufficient precondition for popular sovereignty, inevitably the degradation of national sovereignty led to the erosion of popular sovereignty. Now, this failure is most obvious in the periphery, in places like Afghanistan, Libya, and Iraq. So a string of countries where central authority was demolished by economic siege in the form of UN sanctions and then by military force, and where these societies have regressed into effectively permanent ethnic conflict and civil war. However, in the core, efforts to expand global democracy and law became the form of a new technocratic intergovernmentalism. So horizontal integration across states, just to say elite collaboration, expanded, while vertical integration within states, the kind of political integration that was once done through mass political parties and through civil society organizations such as trade unions and churches, that withered away, leaving a cast of globally networked state and corporate elites on the one hand, and on the other hand a morass of suspicious, anomic and alienated citizens, the left behind. So the internal relations through which the political authority of the state had been hitherto constituted had decayed. The end result of this fissure, then, is that we have globally networked states with weak legitimacy, susceptible to constant populist insurrections at the ballot box, and trapped in vicious cycles of authoritarianism and elite isolation. It's also worth stressing that an international order denuded of sovereignty has also been a highly militarized and belligerent one. So against all of those people who argued that international integration was needed to overcome the constant wars between jealous sovereigns with their petty rivalries and squabbles over territory, our post-Cold War era, from the early 1990s up until the present, has also seen a stream of lethal and highly destructive military adventures. And it's a militarism that is both cause and consequence of the erosion of sovereignty. So it's a cause of the erosion of sovereignty in the military adventures and bombing campaigns that have, as I've already mentioned, pulverized centralized states in poor and fragile countries such as Libya and Iraq, but it's also a consequence of the erosion of sovereignty in Western states. So supranational integration and the pooling of sovereignty has led to so-called burden sharing and outsourcing of the costs of militarism to NATO and UN peacekeeping, reducing the costs of warfighting and occupation, thereby making it easier to do. At the same time, the supranational justification and authorization for war fighting wars for human rights instead of national interests, justifying wars by reference to UN resolutions and NATO commitments rather than the national interest, has allowed states not only to lower the costs of militarism in terms of blood and treasure, but also in political terms. So wars are no longer accounted for or justified by reference to the national interests of citizens. So against the notion that cosmopolitanism means peace, supranational integration and human rights have made perpetual war a reality across North Africa and the Middle East, and now it seems in Europe too. So I want to argue that as a species, we've collectively tested the argument that sovereignty is the problem, and that now it's time to consider the notion that sovereignty might be, in fact, the solution, not the problem. And sovereignty is needed both with respect to rights and with respect to democracy. So human rights, which is to say rights detached from a sovereign state, have tended to sever the bearer and the subject of rights. So as rights become detached from structures of national citizenship, the bearers of human rights have no capacity and no institutionalized processes through which they can shape the process of actually forming, implementing, and exercising rights. And this is why human rights have tended to empower judges, especially supranational judges at the expense of citizens, and in the extreme case, NATO and the UN at the expense of states. So to be meaningful, individual rights have to be intertwined with political agency, which means that they have to be embedded in institutionalized political and legal processes in the context of democratic national citizenship. Without nations in which rights are articulated and embedded, human rights inevitably means expanding the rights of judges and supranational institutions at the expense of individuals. Human rights means concentrating rights in the hands of judges and military planners in Strasbourg and Brussels. Similarly with democracy, sovereignty is necessary to make democracy meaningful. And it does this service by making the exercise of collective political power visible and therefore accountable. That is to say, it is necessary to have clear, concentrated focus of collective power, if that power is to be controllable by those over whom it is exercised. And this means, of necessity, state sovereignty needs to be legally and politically separated from entanglement with other states. Sovereignty is needed to enable the formation of collective political choices and political outcomes. Sovereignty is a necessary precondition, in other words, for the responsible exercise of political power. Is there a problem with the mic? Yeah,
it's just a bit.
It's echoing.
So, so if we do that, can you just have a go? Go on.
So is that better? Yeah. All right.
If we've heard you, it's just to get.
Great. So, as I was saying, sovereignty is a necessary precondition for the responsible exercise of political power. Without sovereignty, power is too diffuse to be meaningful. It's dispersed across different structures, which is called so-called multi-level governance in the political science literature. It's lost between regional assemblies, devolved parliaments, quangos, supreme courts, supranational councils and elections, all of which give special interest groups plenty of opportunity to capture power and to displace ordinary citizens' interests. So, having summarized some of the political features of this prior era of unipolar globalization and how sovereignty has been degraded in that era, I want to turn to talk about how this impacts international order today, especially in the context of war in Europe. Now, despite the evident failures of neoliberal cosmopolitanism, there is no organized political effort anywhere in the world today to recombine the strands of democracy, rights, and sovereignty in either new or old national forms. So in the EU, supranational integration continues, with efforts to strengthen joint borrowing within the Eurozone, despite the absence of a single polity or integrated fiscal union that could bear the costs of such borrowing. The EU is experimenting at the moment with so-called anti-fragmentation instruments, which are intended to prevent the Eurozone from being torn apart between its northern and southern tiers in response to a rise in interest rates, precipitating a new Eurozone sovereign debt crisis. And there's also the effort to mount a collective response to the disruption in energy supplies. All of this enhanced technocratic intergovernmentalism, all of this is happening in the midst of deep citizen mistrust, voter volatility, and brewing discontent among citizens who will now likely confront a winter with energy rationing. Of course, the most brutal denial of sovereignty in Europe today is in Ukraine. And this is evident not only with the Russian invasion and occupation of eastern Ukraine and Russian President Vladimir Putin's denial of even the existence of a Ukrainian nation, but also in the rump of western Ukraine that is not occupied by Russia, which is increasingly swallowed up by NATO and the EU. Ukraine has been granted the hallowed status of becoming a candidate member of the EU, while NATO generals and European leaders openly squabble about what Ukraine's war aims should be. NATO advisors dictate battlefield strategy, and the Ukrainian state is constitutionally committed to joining NATO and the EU. I want to talk a bit more, in a little more detail about Ukraine, as I believe that the course of the war in Ukraine illustrates just how far the idea of sovereign independence has been eclipsed in the international order, and that this is most tellingly visible in Russia's abandonment of any political commitment to sovereign independence. So in the aftermath of the Cold War, when Western states began to claim human rights as battering rams for their military expeditions against states in the developing world, Russia, like many other large countries with restive, peripheral ethnic minorities, Russia tried to lay claim to a principled commitment to defend the rights of sovereign states against outside interference. So Russia, as is well known, Russia threatened to use its veto in the UN Security Council, which forced the US and its allies to forego United Nations authorization for their wars on Yugoslavia in 1999 and Iraq in 2003. And prior to Vladimir Putin's embrace of a conservative defense of Christian civilization, he even experimented with defending his system as a sovereign democracy, to contrast it with the transnational liberalism of the West. But this position has crumbled away. So Russia supported US intervention in Afghanistan. Russia smoothed the path for NATO expansion into Central Asia. Russia invaded and then dismembered Georgia in 2008, recognizing breakaway ethnic enclaves and making them de facto Russian protectorates. Russia abstained on the UN Security Council over the bombing of Libya in 2011 by NATO, and this allowed the NATO campaign to go ahead with UN support at the time. In 2014, Russia intervened in Ukraine in support of rebels in East Ukraine, and in 2015, Russia intervened in the Syrian civil war in favor of the incumbent government of Bashar al-Assad. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 was justified with direct reference to the ruling of the International Court of Justice in 2008 that had found in favor of Kosovo's unilateral declaration of independence from Serbia, which was the end result of NATO's 1999 war. So in other words, Russia has consistently justified its actions with explicit reference to Western precedents, right down to claiming to defend Syrians, Russian-speaking Ukrainians, Ossetians and Abkhazians from persecution and genocide. NATO cleared the path for Putin, and by the time we reached 2014, we were treated to the utterly unedifying spectacle of the US accusing Russia of breaking international law and arbitrarily violating the sovereignty of other states. So in contrast to earlier periods, there was no willingness from any major state to defend the principle of territorial integrity, international legal equality, or sovereign right to freedom from external interference. And even more worryingly was the reaction outside of Europe. So if you take India, a rising major power, the world's largest democracy, itself a formerly colonized country and a long-time opponent and critic of humanitarian intervention, India was nonetheless cool, if not directly supportive, of Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, and it's continued to be indifferent to Russian actions in Ukraine since then. So what this means is that even the slender bases of organized political support for the principle of national sovereignty that existed in world politics around the turn of the century outside of the West has withered away. We're entering a new era of greater geopolitical rivalry alongside the same old practices of the previous era, in which the rights of political independence and national sovereignty are consistently gouged from the outside and hollowed out from within. Now, on the face of it, this is strange, right? Because in eras of geopolitical rivalry, we've tended to see greater space for smaller powers to balance and maneuver between larger states. So if you think of Willy Brandt's Ostpolitik in the Cold War, or the Gaullist withdrawal from NATO and establishment of nuclear independence in the 1960s, or of Third World non-alignment. Yet thus far, there are no assertions of greater political independence that have emerged to take advantage of these geopolitical rivalries between major states. So the result is that we have the worst aspects of the unipolar era, with great power predation on smaller and weaker states, the continuing decline of popular sovereignty and representative government, compounded with the risks of geopolitical rivalry. Just to say, geopolitical rivalry that is no longer offset by the structures of détente, deterrence, hotlines, and arms control agreements that had been built up over the course of the Cold War. So the only country where the prospects for some assertion of political independence was most propitious was here in Britain, with the popular referendum in 2016, which was explicitly on the question of sovereignty and supranational integration. And the vote favoured sovereignty over supranationalism, and it was repeatedly vindicated in the national votes since then. This opportunity has been largely squandered. Popular pressure has dissipated, and the window to squeeze out political and economic advantages of divergence is rapidly closing. There's no evidence in the course of British foreign policy or domestic policy that these opportunities will be seized. Now, as this is a lecture about international order, I'm going to keep my focus on the question of international order. And I want to say that the failure to reap the democratic benefits of Brexit is most obvious with Britain's support for the NATO war in Ukraine. And while it is worth emphasizing that obviously the war is Vladimir Putin's war, it is plainly also NATO's war. After a decade and a half of antagonizing Russia over NATO expansion in Eastern Europe generally, and into Ukraine in particular, Britain has now twice cut off opportunities for ceasefires or armistice initiated by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and in cooperating with Europe, with the EU that is, over European security, it is clear that the British state is hoping to reduce the costs of divergence from the EU, to use Britain's military role as leverage, and thereby to minimize the democratic disruption of Brexit spilling over into the international arena. Even though Britain is not at war with Russia, rallying together with the EU against Russia is the excuse to avoid antagonizing EU states by initiating the kind of political and economic changes that would help Britain to pull away from the sclerotic member states of the Eurozone. As with the EU, NATO institutionalizes permanent elite cooperation at the supranational level at the expense of democratic representation at the national level. In both cases, supranational bureaucracy based in Brussels is deliberately designed to insulate policymaking from democratic input and oversight. In short, NATO locks in globalist supranationalism over Britain's defence and security policy, and in the context of the EU standoff with Moscow, it keeps Britain trapped in the EU orbit outside and despite of Brexit. It allows for the perpetuation of an elite globalism at the expense of popular concerns. Now here, Britain's policy over Ukraine is consistent with the idea of global Britain, which, if you remember, was offered by the Remain-supporting Prime Minister Theresa May explicitly as a project of democratic containment. The vision of a post-Brexit global Britain was intended to signal the continuity of Britain as a networked member state rather than as an independent nation state, a state that was thoroughly integrated into supranational institutions. Global Britain was meant to signal a sovereign to sovereign wealth funds and foreign oligarchs that were investing in London's property market, to multinational banks and corporations, to political elites abroad, and to NATO bureaucrats in Brussels. It was intended to signal that it was going to be business as usual, that working class voters in forgotten parts of the country were not going to tear the gaze of London's elites from the outside world. And thus it is no surprise that the war policy is popular with the Remain and Rejoin supporting middle classes, who are obviously happy to shed Ukrainian blood in order to keep Britain in the orbit of the EU, to keep Britain locked into supranational commitments, and in order to revenge themselves on the man that they still blame for Brexit in the first place, Vladimir Putin. Now, despite these setbacks for popular control in Britain, Britain's formal withdrawal from the EU bloc 2 years ago means that there is still a political and legal basis on which to deepen and strengthen a politics of national sovereignty and political independence. How to do this in the current European order, how to thread that needle. Now, as the politics of sovereignty is a politics of popular control, of strengthening the rights, authority and power of the populace over the state, it has to begin at the national level. And in the context of a war in Europe and Britain's involvement in a proxy war with Russia, in which Ukraine is the battlefield, the demands of anti-militarism and popular sovereignty in Britain demands that we need a new anti-war movement. And the slogan and aim of that anti-war movement should be to Brexit from NATO. That is to say, we should extend the politics of sovereign withdrawal from supranational militarism associated with this aged alliance. And in this penultimate part of the lecture, I just want to briefly discuss what such a politics might involve for Britain and for Europe. And that means briefly reviewing what NATO is. Now, on the face of it, NATO and the EU look very different, right? NATO is a military alliance ostensibly organized on the principle of collective self-defense, and the EU is frequently cast as this overarching bureaucracy and perhaps even a fledgling superstate. And while an island nation withdrawing from the EU would seem to make sense, perhaps, even to critics of Brexit, it would seem, why would you compound British isolation by withdrawing from the world's most powerful military alliance, an alliance that ostensibly helps to preserve British independence, rather than dissolving it away? And I want to argue that that view misconceives both NATO and the EU. The truth is that NATO and the EU are very similar in respect of their origins, their membership, their structure, and their post-Cold War development. Now, both NATO and the EU are treaty-based systems that formally claim to preserve the independence of their member states while compromising them in practice. Both organizations were founded at the onset of the Cold War in the late 1940s with the aim of cohering Western Europe in the face of Soviet might. After the Cold War ended, both NATO and the EU had to find new roles for themselves. And when NATO was founded in 1949, it was intended to preserve the US military presence in Europe, to contain German rearmament, and to deter potential Soviet expansion. How did it adapt to the end of all of these problems? It became global, right? It went global. It became a supranational organization rather than a military alliance. Originally conceived as a means of protecting independence of its member states, since the end of the Cold War, NATO has been the leading vehicle for suppressing state sovereignty, championing human rights and humanitarianism, beginning with its bombing campaigns in Bosnia, the war in Kosovo, to its support for the forever war in Afghanistan, as well as the disastrous war in Libya in 2011. It is no surprise that NATO is now determining the conduct of the war in Ukraine, and that is not even to mention about NATO's eastward expansion in tandem with EU expansion and how it recklessly antagonized Russia, promoted the interests of Russian nationalists over Russian Democrats and liberals, and ultimately helped precipitate the Russian intervention. Given this history, it is no surprise that NATO is stoking a proxy war in Ukraine. It's no surprise that it's indifferent to the suffering of Ukrainians, but also to Ukrainian independence. NATO is interested in bleeding Russia white, in turning Ukraine into a new Afghanistan in Europe, and thereby substituting a new forever war in Europe to replace the one that they lost in Afghanistan. Whatever defense from continental hegemony that NATO might once have offered Britain is long gone. So Russia is struggling to occupy a neighboring country. The notion that Russia could rampage across Eastern Europe and sweep through into the Low Countries to menace Britain from across the English Channel, that's delusional. So following on from Brexit, NATO has been a bulwark of foreign policy continuity for our disoriented Remainer elites. With the war in Ukraine, NATO will not only be a vehicle for Remainers to wreak their revenge on Russia in their paranoid delusions over Brexit, but it also risks the return of Brino, which is to say Brexit in name only. The NATO proxy war in Ukraine strengthens all the forces of inertia and conservatism within Britain's elites. European security will be invoked by rejoiner civil servants to contain any political challenge by Britain's elected representatives, as well as providing a reason for British governments to avoid the hard task of crafting policies for regulatory divergence that will inevitably antagonize the EU. So if Britain is serious about the project that was staked out by the electorate in 2016, that is about reviving its national sovereignty, this requires strengthening national and popular sovereignty in Britain itself, and also creating an international order that is hospitable to and respectful of national sovereignty, not only that of Britain but of all nations. If the national democratic logic of Brexit, the logic of sovereignty, is to be preserved and expanded, then we must Brexit from NATO. NATO's history of forever wars for human rights will always be an obstacle to that democratic project of Brexit. NATO entrenches liberal globalist concerns at the expense of our domestic priorities, and this was made very clear recently when Boris Johnson opted for a trip to Kiev over a trip to rally voters in Doncaster. They will always opt for Kiev over Doncaster, absolutely. Forever wars for democracy and human rights will always prove more alluring for our governing classes than levelling up, boosting productivity, or democratizing local government. Now, I want to finish up by arguing about what Brexit will also offer the wider world. I think Brexiting from NATO would offer up a genuine international leadership in place of the tatty corporate and focused group branding of global Britain. Brexiting from NATO would signal to the peoples of the world Britain's break from the era of humanitarian imperialism and a history of militarism. It would signal a powerful commitment to national independence everywhere. It would also offer, I think, Ukraine a politics that would be valuable to Ukraine in its struggle for its own independence. Obviously, Ukrainians have the most obvious and stark interest in national independence in Europe today. And obviously, Ukrainians need guns to defend themselves and their territory. But if war is a continuation of politics by other means, then Ukrainians also need politics. And if they are struggling for independence, they need to be able to formulate that politics independently. Those guns that are coming from NATO are coming with NATO priorities for NATO's own war with Russia. So in the current war, Ukraine is squeezed between East and West. On the one hand, Ukraine confronts an increasingly isolated, authoritarian and paranoid ruler in Moscow who's overseeing a nationalist elite that are determined to preserve Russia's access to the Black Sea and to fend off encroachment of NATO bases so close to Moscow and to Russia's European core. On the other hand, Ukraine confronts its weapon suppliers, Western states who have a long history of buying proxies to fight their wars for them, from the KLA in Kosovo to international jihadis in Syria and Libya, and now in Ukraine. Western elites know the advantages of protracted diversionary war, and in Washington, D.C., I suspect the deep state is still fighting a rearguard action against Trump and Trumpism and his perceived international ally, Vladimir Putin. And this situation goes back to the Ukrainian civil war and Maidan uprising of 2014, when EU and NATO expansion consistently aggravated internal tensions within Ukraine itself between its eastern and western provinces, an internal division that Russia was willing to ruthlessly exploit in order to carve out its own protectorates in Ukrainian territory, and that the EU and NATO were ultimately indifferent to. Now, the risk for Ukraine is not only indefinite Russian occupation of its eastern territory, but also being ground away between West and East. And Ukrainian President Zelensky's efforts to break out of this trap by trying to rein in the neo-fascist militias who are constantly seeking to renew the war in East Ukraine, or when he said that Ukraine should opt for a position of neutrality between Moscow and Brussels, or claiming that a post-war Ukraine would be more similar to Israel than a European state, all of these efforts have been thwarted by the oligarch-backed right-wing militia that have now been incorporated into Ukraine's national army, as well as by the pro-EU and NATO arms of the Ukrainian state in the Ukrainian ministries of defense and foreign affairs, and indeed by the Ukrainian constitution itself, which commits Ukraine to becoming a member state of both NATO and the EU. So, Brexiting from NATO would carve out a geopolitical space in Europe that would give Ukrainians a third option in their battle for independence. For Britain to declare our armed neutrality between Moscow and Brussels would make that a more realistic position for Ukraine. And it's a position that is Ukraine's only hope to end the war quickly. not only to secure Russian withdrawal from occupied territory, but also to stymie the possibility of renewed Russian military intervention in future after Russian withdrawal. Strengthening popular sovereignty in Britain, pursuing the logic of Brexit, helps to form an international order in which national independence and popular sovereignty is strengthened at the expense of supranational integration and oligarchic politics. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.